Indian telecom operators like Airtel, Vodafone Idea, Reliance Jio have all made an appeal to the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, asking for the Telecommunications Act to include a new category of authorization for internet-based messaging services and calling service like WhatsApp and Telegram, etc. Right? This is a part of a TRAI consultation, and the telecom regulator TRAI does regular consultations on policies related to telecom and internet, mostly telecom, seeking inputs on service authorization under the Telecommunications Act 2023. It's a little technical, and I'll get into those technicalities later. But what our telecom operators are arguing is that the current definition of telecommunications is broad enough to include and regulate online messaging services, which they call OTTs. Airtel and Vodafone have advocated that there should be a level playing field, and online uh, messaging services should help in law enforcement, ensure data privacy, security, accountability, and contribute to the nation's exchequer. So we'll go through this one by one, right? So first is, what is the Telecommunications Act? Now, there used to be a Telegraph Act from the 1800s, that was replaced with the Telecommunications Act last year. It was passed in Parliament in December. And there was a lot of controversy around it because it had provisions for surveillance, authorization, licensing, and a lot of conditions that apply to telecom operators and historically have applied to telecom operators, but it appeared to apply to apps and the internet because the drafting was really vague. Now, in its submission here, Airtel has actually used this. They've said that the broad definition of telecommunications, which reads according to the law, any sign, signal, writing, text, image, sound, video, data stream, intelligence, or information sent through telecommunications includes messaging services. So it's so broad in its definition, and they're right about that, that it can be construed as including online messaging services like Slack, like Microsoft Teams, Google Chat, or whatever it's called now. Um, Google Meet for video conversations, could include WhatsApp, could include Telegram, could include Signal, and a host of other messaging apps that are available across the world. Now, but it isn't really as simple as this, right? In fact, there was a lot of criticism of this. I criticized it quite extensively as well. The previous minister for communications, Ashwini Vaishnav, who's our current minister for IT and information and broadcasting, had clarified last year, and he told the Economic Times that over-the-top services, as these messaging services are called, are not covered under the Telecommunications Bill 2023. He had said that OTT has been regulated by the IT Act of 2000 and continues to be regulated by the IT Act, he's explained, right? But like I said, it isn't as simple as this. Because before this in Parliament, while the bill was being discussed and debated, he had been repeatedly asked by MPs about whether the internet is covered, whether messaging apps are covered, and he'd sidestepped the question about this OTT. In fact, what had happened was that on his LinkedIn, he'd posted a set of clarifications related to the telecommunications bill once, and amongst them were three golden words that OTT kept out. And there was a PDF, and so someone took a screenshot of it. We downloaded the PDF as well, and that none of them had an official government logo. And then Mr. Vaishnav deleted that post. Now, the same PDF I know had been given by the ministry to some companies and industry associations, but it was never made official. Like I said, no signature, no logo, but something they were distributing as a clarification. And so many industry associations and entities were seeing that as a clarification, even though the Telecom Act, by the way it's drafted, seems vague. Now there's a new Minister of State for Communications and a new TRAI chairman. And it seems that the telecom operators are basically back to their old tricks. They're saying the same old things and trying to again get the government to regulate or license messaging services, just like telecom operators are, right? So what are they saying? The first argument, which I've been hearing since 2012, is same service, same rules, that online messaging services are providing the same services as telecom operators, and therefore the same rules should apply. So they're saying there should be a new category of authorization for online services like WhatsApp and Telegram. Telecom operators are saying that they perform the same services like voice calls, messaging, and without the kind of regulatory burdens or regulatory restrictions that regular calling and regular SMSs has. So by bringing them under the same regulatory purview, they would essentially be leveling the playing field, and they would be operating on an equal footing as compared to telecom services, right? Um, so let's address the same service, same rules argument first. So same service, same rules, the flawed argument. They're not the same service. Online messaging services are basically, unlike telecom services, based on internet protocol. Traditional telecom services are infrastructure heavy. They rely on spectrum directly. They use physical networks, which basically may justify the stringent regulations they face because, if you think about it, spectrum is a scarce resource. Um, and if you look at online services, they operate over the internet. It's the internet which is a service that telecom operators provide, and these operate on top of the internet. They don't directly utilize physical infrastructure. They don't directly, utilize spectrum, unlike messaging and calling that telecom operators provide. Secondly, online messaging services can be integrated into several services like websites for customer support for a chatbot, right? Many the messaging that's a part of games. If you play Clash of Clans, you can interact with other members of your group, for example, as a part of messaging in those games. UPI apps, which are meant for payments, allow users to message each other and send a message along with the payment. In fact, one of the arguments that Airtel had made in another consultation was that Paytm should also be should require a messaging license to operate because they provide the same messaging service, right? They're not the same service. Additionally, these are rich services, right? Online messaging is rich. They have audio, video, text, emojis, memes, stickers, and also interactive features like polls, location sharing. You can actually do group video calls with each other. You can interact with each other. So, whereas traditional SMS has none of this because it's not internet based. They aren't the same service, so therefore the same rules shouldn't apply. Um, you know, uh, I can take an XMTP protocol, right? Many of these online messaging services are protocol based. I can take an XMTP protocol and anyone can create a messaging app. Slack has an API which allows users to engage with services in the messaging app. Like I can get Google Analytics data pushed directly to it. I can get certain server information pushed directly to it. There are people who use Slack in different ways because it has an API and it can integrate with Slack, which is essentially a messaging uh, sort of space. And you have communities on WhatsApp in the same way. Um, and you have WhatsApp for Business, which you can again use to push similar information directly from an API. So internet protocol allows APIs to interact with each other and therefore multiple services to engage with each other, which is not possible for SMS. Then the services that telecom operators also provide, they're basically their primary services. They're great pipes for accessing the internet, and that's what they should be. SMS and regular voice calling is now such a small part of their service. Most of it is free. So my thing is telecom operators should change for the future and be the best pipes possible and provide great internet access. In fact, the former TRAI chairman R.S. Sharma used to talk about unbundling and saying that there are the services that are provided on the internet have been unbundled from access. And it is our ability to use these services to create new experiences for developers, for programmers, to integrate messaging into different services and to create a completely new experience. Like, for example, disappearing messages or some of the features that Snapchat has, right? So telcos don't want to compete with these online players. They don't want to build a better messaging service. So they're trying to hurt them using regulation. And it's not like telecom operators haven't built their own services before. Airtel had Wink, which was a music streaming service that they provided, that they still provide. Right? They have a video streaming service called Xstream. So they have all of these services that they're using to compete with online players. It doesn't mean that they can't build their own messaging app. They're just trying to hurt existing players to with regulation to basically give themselves a benefit. Now, telecom operators are also saying that it could that bringing these online messaging services under a regulatory framework could help with law enforcement. It could facilitate lawful interception of messages and maintain and help in maintaining a record of user activities and things like that, right? Now, the fact is, we need surveillance reform in India. I mean, I remember it was reported almost 10 years ago that there are around 300 surveillance orders being given in our country every day. Our surveillance agencies are not accountable to Parliament today. They have been created with an ordinance. We know that surveillance happens for political reasons as well. And messaging services like Signal and WhatsApp are probably amongst the only few platforms where we have a sense of privacy and security in our personal communications. How do we know that people aren't being snooped on for personal reasons here? And that governments are already hacking devices. We know that, for example, Pegasus has been used by governments across the world, and it's alleged that they've been used by the Indian government as well. The Supreme Court hasn't addressed the surveillance question yet. And so now by bringing these applications under a regulatory framework, they want to enable surveillance of the only medium that we have, which is a safe medium to use. It's ridiculous. Now, telecom operators also believe that on authorization of messaging services would have other benefits, like they can ensure consumer protection, network security, and compliance, and because they'll be subjected online messaging services will be subjected to the same regulations as them. And they argue that regulation can ensure that they adhere to data privacy and security and accountability standards, including user authorization processes and fraud prevention measures. Right. Now, let's look at fraud first. Is there less fraud and spam on telecom networks because there is user authorization? No, there's more spam. User authorization is not being able to address the problem of spam and fraud. Whereas there's less spam and fraud on online messaging because they have better processes. I mean, mostly the SMSs that you get that lead to frauds, or the calls that you get that lead to frauds, are coming almost entirely from regular telecom networks. And telecom operators don't have the ability to deal with it because many of those people actually buy their SIM cards and sign up for their services and pay for these messages, etc., from the same telecom operators. Telecom operators actually actively benefit from fraud. In fact, what we trust today is online messaging because they're not telecom operators, because there's less fraud and less spam. So there are attempts to fraud and spam on those platforms as well. But that's reduced substantially because they are more active in preventing fraud and spam. Telecom operators are failing to do that. And online messaging platforms don't monetarily benefit from this kind of spam. Uh, Telecom operators do. Additionally, when it comes to privacy, I mean, data protection laws apply to internet companies in the same way that they apply to telecom operators. So I don't see what's the difference here. They can't argue that data privacy regulations don't apply to online players. Um, in fact, they apply probably more, and telecom operators it actually they apply to both of them equally, right? From a security perspective, most the popular apps actually have better security and accountability than telecom networks do. There are global messaging apps from a security standpoint that get stress tested by security researchers all the time. Everyone's trying to hack into them because there are more people using these apps globally than a telecom operator in India. Um, and given the mess that is consumer protection and network security on telecom networks, especially given the surveillance that's possible on GSM networks with GSM sniffers, etc., we're better off with end-to-end encryption platforms, right? So I don't want end-to-end encryption platforms to be brought under this regulation and end-to-end encryption be broken because we know that's what the government wants. Why are telecom operators pushing for us to be surveilled more is a question to ask here. Why are telecom operators trying to get end-to-end encryption broken is a question to be asked here. Now, another arguments that the telecom operators make are related to global precedents. So they say that the EU's electronic communications code, for example, classifies OTTs or online messaging into two categories: number dependent and number independent, and that the similar rules on number dependent services as traditional telecom services, while lighter regulatory regime is for number independent OTT services. In Singapore, they say OTT services are required to obtain a service based operating license with certain minimum operating standards. In other regions, they're saying that Trinidad and Tobago are also considering regulation of OTTs or online messaging here. Now, frankly, India's got a much better international internet environment for innovation, for building startups than the EU has because of lack of such overbearing regulations. I mean, why should you have a license to start a messaging app? Frankly, why should you have an authorization to start a messaging app? That's as we've seen with the broadcast bill, compliance is a form of censorship. Compliance burden, as we'll have over here, will mean that lesser services will be launched. There's be less innovation. In India, most large messaging services actually use messaging mobile numbers as identifiers. But just because the EU and Singapore have identified this as a mechanism, and Singapore is hardly a liberal democracy like ours, what's the rationale that they're making for this, right? Two jurisdictions is hardly a representative of a global approach. And this is just a selective citation or two, three jurisdictions to show precedents. Tell me one country in the world where WhatsApp, Telegram, or Signal are licensed or have like in a similar regulatory regime where they've actually got authorization. I think the telecom operators are basically clutching at straws over here. They make one argument. This time they made an argument on network usage fees earlier. They're just trying every single argument to try and get messaging services to be brought under a regulation, which the government might want, which telecom operators definitely want, but consumers and developers in this country don't. Right now, also let me address the point about that Vodafone idea is made, or V as it's called now, is made about the contribution to the national exchequer. Right, companies that are operating in India already contribute to the national exchequer by paying taxes. Those that operate from other jurisdictions, there's a taxation issue, which is a global taxation issue for the tax authority to look into. Slack is owned by Salesforce, Teams is owned by Microsoft, WhatsApp by Meta. Are you saying that none of these companies pay tax in India? Of course they do. So Geo also says that, authorized service providers should hand over internet telephony calls originated by international outroamers from international locations at their international gateway, and then there should be an international termination charge to the terminating access service provider. Now that sounds like a lot of jargon, but what they're saying is that if you're roaming abroad, then and you're using, let's say, WhatsApp or Telegram for calling, then the service needs to pay like a termination charge because that call is being handled internationally. I mean, seriously, the reason why people switched over to WhatsApp calling and WhatsApp messaging and Telegram and other services and Signal uh, is because they can speak with their loved ones across the world at the cost of data, which is next to nothing for them compared to the exorbitant, overbearing termination charges or the fees that telecom operators charge for international calling. Telecom operators have been profiteering from this. Now you want to restrict after a decade of being able to make these calls at such cheap rates globally, almost at data prices, which is next to nothing. You now want to restrict them from doing that. I don't think consumers will actually do this. So all in all, what it seems to me is that telecom operators are basically stuck in the past and they want to drag us back into the past with them. And I think we should have a situation where the TRAI rejects such demands. And hopefully, the new Minister for Communications is going to look at these issues, look at how they played out in the past, and not bow down to what the telecom operators are demanding, which would actually hurt us as consumers in terms of the internet that we use. We need a better regulatory environment for the internet, not a worse one like the telecom operators want.